Yeah, I want to see 100,000 people in Sinn Fein. I have no doubt about it, it's going to happen.
It has progressed to the point today that Sinn Fein presents the best set of proposals.
Fantasy land. Doesn't interact with reality whatsoever.
If you look up the characteristics of a cult, Sinn Fein tick an awful lot of those boxes.
Did you recruit young men into the IRA?
Of course I did, yes.
The dogs in the street know that the IRA was engaged in criminality.
IRA were bad, British were good, the Irish were good, and 1916 was good, but actually up here was bad. Not true. This is as complex up here in our age as it was in Dublin in that age.
If they were going to kill me because of my role in the peace process, I'll die happily for that, for peace.
At home with his family, Martin Ferris could be any TD from any part of the country. But his political life was not always so peaceful. Like Sinn Fein itself, he has travelled a troubled road that began with a youthful call to arms.
I joined the IRA the day after my father was buried in May of 1970. And from that on, I became an IRA activist.
Martin Ferris operated under the IRA Southern Command, whose job it was to raise funds for Republican operations in the north. Have you come to the conclusion that just violence is never the way? It doesn't work?
I believe strongly that whatever freedom we have in this part of our state would not have come about unless we had violence.
You still believe that?
And if you had no 1916 rising, if you had no 1918-21 War of Independence, would you have freedom in the 26 counties? No.
After 2 spells in prison in the 1970s, that included 47 days on hunger strike, Martin Ferris was released. But his worst moment was yet to come. In 1984, Ferris was arrested on board the Marita Ann. It was picking up arms and ammunition from the Valhalla, a ship that had sailed from Boston. He was sentenced to 10 years in jail, where he could reflect on the fact that he had been betrayed by his neighbour and friend, Sean O'Callaghan. Now, I know you're saying that, what can you believe Sean O'Callaghan says, but he does describe you as a bully. That's how he described you, and he particularly said he didn't like you because of the way you recruited young men into the IRA, into that life. And he talked about the IRA training people how to lie, training the people into being duplicitous, to being able to tell barefaced lies.
Again, like, I have never read Sean O'Callaghan's book because to me it's what he says about me and anybody else. You must remember that Sean O'Callaghan's sole intention is to try and damage
Were you a bully?
I hope not.
Did you recruit young men into the IRA?
Of course I did, yes.
It has now emerged that one of the main players on the US side of the arms deal was the notorious Boston gangster James Whitey Bulger, an infamous drug dealer implicated in dozens of murders. Did you realise that the guns were coming from that Boston criminal, Whitey Bulger?
No.
And what do you think now, knowing what we know about Whitey Bulger?
I don't know. I hadn't a clue about my job as an IRA volunteer was to take the weapons, get them ashore, make sure they were secure. Unfortunately, I didn't get them ashore. They certainly weren't secure, and I ended up in prison. If I had known that, if we had known that, if the IRA had known that at the time, would they have anything to do with Whitey Bulger? No, absolutely not.
Why?
Because, as you say, he was a gangster.
The question for Sinn Fein and everyone else is, what separates a gangster from a freedom fighter? To the IRA, robbing banks or smuggling fuel was okay, if it was for the cause. Caoimhín O'Caolan was the party's first TD to be elected to the Modern Dáil. He is a former employee of the Bank of Ireland. Criminality played a big role in the IRA. Is that all finished now?
I don't believe that it ever did. That's your view. Some may hold that view. But I mean, make no mistake about it. I mean,
but IRA activists they rob banks, maybe even the Bank of Ireland?
And so did Michael Collins. So did the IRA of its time. People deal with the situation as it presented in its time. So let's not try to make fish of one and flesh of another. Let's just face up to the facts. It was no different in any decade in terms of the 20th century. IRA activity or any other organisation of its ilk. The fact of the matter is, and the most important thing, and rather than, as I've said, being fixated on the past, let us joyfully look forward to the future.
The dogs in the street know that the IRA was engaged in criminality, to raise funds for the war that it perpetrated on the people of this island.
The IRA or the ex-IRA, if it's true that they've gone out of business now, were heavily involved in criminality, protection rackets, smuggling, robberies, and that information was certainly available to the government at the time.
The bottom line is they weren't all great patriots. Some of them were psychopaths. Some of them were patriots. Some of them were driven by ideology. Others were driven by power within their own organisation. Some enjoyed the killing. Some did the killing they felt out of political necessity. And you had all that mixed in a tightly, rigidly controlled command structure that then had to, in a sense, feed itself in money and other terms. It became just one massive bombing machine, killing machine, citizens' defence machine, as it would see it. That had to be fed, that had to be weaponed up, that had to be armed, that had to be motivated.
You can't have it both ways, you see. You can either criminalise this conflict, which I will argue for the next 10 hours over, right? Or you can accept that in 1916 it was not a criminal because they did bank robberies then too, you know. The IRA was involved, things like that then. Or you can take it in the context of there was a conflict, it was a military conflict, and things were done during that conflict.
Stalin called those revolutionary expropriations. It's the same thing. But you know, the IRA has always robbed banks and post offices and so on, because it's British, so it doesn't matter.
In any war, and including if you go back into our history, in the Tan War and before, kind of those who were involved in challenging the British Army were involved in trying to fundraise and finance that, and that involves sometimes robbing banks and that. So kind of. So
that was okay then.
Well, kind of. It's not ideal.
If they're saying that, isn't that a classical illustration of the extent to which this party still has mental reservations as to its engagement in democratic politics and a lack of insight as to what is required of those who are engaged to uphold the rule of law?
They were involved in drug dealing, they were involved in bank robberies and so forth. That didn't just stop because of the peace process. That didn't stop because of the ceasefire in '94 or the Belfast Agreement in '98.
In just a few hours, James Monaghan, Niall Connolly and Martin McCauley will face the Colombian justice system. One judge will decide their fate after hearing from both counsels. If found guilty, they could face 20 years in jail.
Robert McCartney was attempting to bring badly injured Devine away from McGuinness's, but the pair were followed into a nearby alleyway by a group of men. Robert McCartney was then stabbed in the abdomen and severely beaten. The 33-year-old was discovered by two passing police officers, but little could be done to save his life.
The bank at the centre of possibly one of the biggest robberies in history. Belfast Northern Bank was targeted by robbers in a clinical and extremely well organised operation, which has netted the raiders in excess of £20 million.
Did you ever find out where the money went?
Well, you're not asking a question, you're making a statement there. Well, the IRA said they were not involved in it. Isn't that true also?
Is that true?
Well, that's what they said.
I'll give you full marks for the discipline, you know, but I won't give you full marks for anything else.
The then Taoiseach Bertie Ahern was in no doubt about who was responsible for the Northern Bank robbery. He was furious with Sinn Fein and pointed the finger at the leadership.
What he said, which I found offensive and untrue, is that myself and Martin McGuinness had prior notice of it. That's totally and blatantly, factually untrue, and I went and engaged with him privately on that matter.
They would challenge anyone to prove that it was the IRA.
Well, they would say that, wouldn't they? What else would you expect them to say?
But what proof do you have that it was the IRA?
Oh, I'm quite satisfied that that was an IRA engagement.
The Northern Bank robbery was the last major crime to be directly linked to Sinn Fein, but militant republicanism has not gone away. Just months after the Good Friday Agreement came the Omagh bombing. Since then, PSNI constables Ronan Kerr and Stephen Carl have been murdered. 2 British soldiers shot dead outside the Mazarine barracks, and a prison officer, David Black, killed as he drove to work.
But we still know that there are small, unrepresentative groups on the Nationalist Republican side who are as dedicated to bringing down the institutions as some of these other people are.
When we have the continuing problem with dissident Republicans, the Sinn Fein leadership criticised dissident Republicans, but only criticised them on tactical issues by saying, you don't have a coherent plan, you can't succeed. What they ought to be saying to them is, we know that what you're doing is wrong. We tried it ourselves and we realised it was the wrong thing to do, and we have left that behind us, and what you are doing is wrong and you should stop too. And to be able to address them from a principled viewpoint would actually be much more effective anyway, but it would involve them acknowledging that what they were doing was wrong.
Our fingerprints were all over the Omagh bomb, that the Omagh bombers were no different from the Enniskillen bombers, probably less immoral, given that the Enniskillen operation was a deliberate attempt to wipe out a civilian population, whereas the Omagh bomb was just a drastic mistake.
Yes, the IRA done terrible wrongs, yes.
What did they do?
Well, it's very easy. The IRA made terrible mistakes.
Like what?
Well, you had Enniskillen, you had Shankill Road, you had other operations that went terrible wrong. You know what I mean?
And why are they mistakes?
Why? Well, I think the best description I've ever heard given in relation to people who were involved in organisations, involved in conflict, was given by Nelson Mandela, when he says, you can never legislate for the fallibility of the combatant. And I think he put it very well, because there's, to my knowledge and my lifetime involved in that, there was no deliberate attempt ever to go out to do an injustice to ordinary decent people, to ordinary people. It happened. It shouldn't have happened, but it happened.
And did you make mistakes?
Of course I did.
You shot innocent civilians.
I didn't say that.
What mistakes did you make?
I made a lot of mistakes. You know, who hasn't? Show me the man or woman alive that hasn't made a mistake.
But as an IRA man, what mistakes did you make?
I made some, yes.
Like what?
I'm not going to say. I don't think you expect me to either.
I do, actually.
No,
I do.
I don't think so, no.
Do they haunt you?
No, they don't haunt me. Do I wish that I hadn't made mistakes? Yes.
Oh, go on. Go on. Go on. Yes. Oh, yeah!
Pearse Doherty has plenty to grapple with. A young family, a constituency more than 4 hours' drive from Dublin, and a political party that has long identified him as a star of the future. How did you end up in Sinn Fein when your dad was Fianna Fáil?
Well, like, my dad was Fianna Fáil, his father was in the IRA at that time, like many people would have been, you know, in the 1920s. So, you know, there was always Republican element in it. They were always believed in a united Ireland. But I stumbled into Sinn Féin by accident, to tell you the truth, you know. When I was in first year in school, I think I was a fella wanting to find something, wanting to do something, you know, when I was first year in secondary school. And I went down to the local library and I got 3 books out of the library. One was JFK, the other one was the Catholic Church, and the other one was a book called Northern Ireland, The History Behind the Troubles. And I read that book, and the last one, Northern Ireland, it was a very boring book, but it was all statistics, and for somebody 13 years of age, it didn't appeal to me. But there was one wee bit in it about Bobby Sands, and that just opened my whole, you know, opened different doors to me, and I wanted to know why would somebody die on hunger strike, and that's where it took me. Now, I'm not here to justify the loss of life of anybody. I know what it's like to lose somebody who's very, very close to you. But at the same time, when there was no other option, I'm not going to, you know, condemn or try to rewrite history for people.
Wasn't there another option?
No, there wasn't. Like, you know,
people in the SDLP would say that there was no need for one life to be lost
Well,
for what? What was it all about?
It was about defending your own community. While streets of houses were being burnt down, while the British Army ran riot in the Bogside and in other areas, it was about standing up and defending them. And I, as an Irish Republican, and every Irish Republican throughout the generations, have had this principle that you stand and defend what's your own.
Pearse, that's fine, except the IRA said it was all about a united Ireland, getting rid of partition and getting the British off the island. None of that happened. So what was the struggle all about?
Well, the struggle, for a start, isn't over. The armed struggle is finished, but the struggle isn't over, and the ideals and aspirations of bringing about a united Ireland is as live and well today as in 2013 as it was 100 years ago.
Have you any stories about Gerry Adams that you could tell us? Anything that gives an insight into him?
He'll tell you himself.
Do you really believe that he was never in the IRA? Do you really believe that?
I think Gerry has made his position very clear on that there, and I have no problem with what he said.
Do you think it's credible, though?
Well, is it credible for you?
Well, I don't know.
But you keep on asking this question. Does it really? How many people actually stop? But you do this all the time, and so does media all the time, and that's okay. You want the story, and that's fine. But like, people on the street don't ask that. And Gerry Adams today, from the last opinion poll, is the most popular leader in this state.
Pearse Doherty entered the Dáil after winning the Donegal Southwest by-election in spectacular style in 2010. He was quickly appointed to the crucial role of finance spokesperson, and he must lead by example.
You know, I know people out there don't like the lives of politicians and they're easy targets. We take home the average industrial wage as Sinn Fein members, so we don't live any big grandiose lives. You know, I could be earning, I'm sure, a lot more if I wasn't involved in politics. But there's just that something inside you that just keeps on pumping at your heart all the time and saying that you have to do something more.
Sinn Féin is now a party of protest. From Rossport in County Mayo to the gates of government buildings, party placards are prominent. The message is clear: we are the party of the people.
It is for the third time a complete capitulation by the Labour Party, who sold their principles for the price of power.
The social consequences of what they are doing is to be seen all around us here.
Don't try and worm your way out of this. You know that this cut is wrong.
A stereotype that I think is completely and utterly wrong is that our economic policies don't add up. And that's a big challenge for the party, it's a big challenge for Sinn Féin and for myself as finance spokesperson to actually convince people.
So what would Ireland look like under Sinn Féin? It would of course be a 32-county state, although the party has no blueprint about where the government would sit or how it would work. There would be no property tax and no water charges. No public sector worker would be paid more than €100,000 a year. Anyone who earned more than that amount would be subject to a new 48% rate of tax.
How real do you think their economic policies are?
It's fantasyland. Fantasyland. Doesn't interact with reality whatsoever. Pearse Doherty won't even admit that they voted for the bank guarantee when it's a matter of record. They're good on rhetoric, but they've no record of economic policy that actually works.
Well, the extraordinary thing, it's kind of extraordinary to me anyway, is that they're very real. But that's because they're very mainstream, they're very ordinary. You sort of expect with Sinn Féin, with their origins, which we know all about, and their tradition at least of being a socialist party, that they'd be saying something terribly different and radical. But when you look at their economic policies, you could put Labour Party on top of all of it without any difficulty, and you could put Fianna Fáil on top of 95% of it, and Fine Gael on top of 90% of it.
It has progressed to the point today that Sinn Féin presents the best set of proposals, acknowledged by a whole raft of economist commentators on different television programmes, including on TV3. Well, a number. I mean, I cannot for a moment just start naming who, but you've seen them on your own television screens.
No, I haven't.
Well, I have certainly. I've seen them certainly. I've seen
Not
them
Sinn
on
Féin proposals. their own proposals.
Oh, well, they may have
Some
proposals.
of them may coincide with stimulus, but they wouldn't be Sinn Fein.
Well, fair enough.
In the context of economic policies, it's effectively flogging a sort of ideological approach to the world that resulted in the economic collapse of the Soviet Union. They're in favour of spending as much money as possible on as many schemes as God could invent, whilst opposing ever the raising of any funds for any particular purpose.
We have proposed a stimulus package, and that is different to any of the other parties.
But you haven't explained where you get the money.
We have explained continuously where the money has come from, and we've explained where the money would go for afterwards, because a stimulus package is an investment of money that is returned in time.
Politically, it makes sense for them at a time when they're in opposition and where they're trying to cut out a patch for themselves in opposition, and they initially look like they might overshadow Fianna Fáil in opposition, although that opportunity has now passed, I think. They're still, if they want to be significant and vocal and strong in opposition, then in a sense taking on the austerity consensus as they would see it is the obvious way for them to go.
Targeting the rich is a popular rallying cry, but the party got into a terrible wrangle before about corporation tax. Their big idea now is a wealth tax.
We want to introduce a wealth tax that will miraculously yield 800 million per year. And then somebody says to them, well, wait a while, if you're introducing a wealth tax, I mean, what about farmers? And what about people with business assets, etc.? Oh, we'll exempt all those. We'll still get 800 million a year. Now, there isn't much reality to that type of economics, and I think more and more people are seeing through it.
Only 4% of the population earns more than 100,000 a year. The Irish have a great feeling that everybody's much richer than we are ourselves, but actually those who earn more than 100 grand are a small minority. Those with net assets of more than $1 million, not only a very small a number, they all meet each other for dinner in fancy restaurants. I mean, we could name most of their names. So the idea that you'd get 800 million from those people on these figures, you wouldn't. You'd get a fraction of that, even if they all stayed and paid it.
The difficulty in relation to the wealth tax is that the Department of Finance can't or won't cost a wealth tax independently.
One weakness that some of your critics have identified is that after the 2007 general election, your performance on the economy, they saw that as your weak point, that you were weak when it came to economic issues and dealing with figures. How fair is that perception?
Well, it is a challenge, of course, to move into a totally different jurisdiction and to learn the detail. But that can be got over. That's
Have you got over that now?
Well, I like to think so, but not only that, we have Pearse Doherty. We have other people who have the singular brief. You see, those who dismissed us as economic illiterates are the people who created the mess.
Sinn Fein is in the unusual position of being in opposition and government on the same island, and that poses a problem.
They hate comparing what they're doing in Northern Ireland to what they're stating in the South, because it's kind of two different Sinn Feins. It's a political party that's in government in the North, doing very well in terms of the decisions that they're having to take, cutting budgets, amalgamations, making sure that public services run better, and they're doing a good job there actually in many respects. But in the South, it's like it's another Sinn Fein.
Yeah. What we disagree with is the misleading and using fig leaves like climate change.
Every political party values loyalty, but in Sinn Fein, dissent is virtually unheard of. Killian Ford is a very rare example of a young, enthusiastic Sinn Fein councillor jumping overboard. He joined Labour, saying he was disillusioned.
If you look up the characteristics of a cult, Sinn Fein tick an awful lot of those boxes. And I'll try and give you a sort of an anecdote that explains that. Jerry Adams did an interview once, I think it was around the time of the McCartney murder, and he said the word minded. I wasn't minded to do X, Y, and Z, whatever it was. I had never heard that phrase before, anybody ever saying it. And within 2 or 3 weeks, all the Sinn Fein spokesperson were saying, well, I wasn't minded to. And it wasn't an instruction or a memo came down from headquarters saying, by the way, this is the language you're using, but the language seeps back into the membership quite quick. But there's very little written instruction from those in the higher positions internally. And there's very little confrontation. I never had a confrontation with people within Sinn Fein. You just know that you did something wrong.
The structures involved in the IRA and Sinn Fein, that discipline, that ability all to sing from the same hymn sheet, that ability to nod their head no matter what is said to them, and paint every adversity as a triumph, or take whatever is thrown at them and go, what's the line today? Right, we will peddle that. That is remarkable. It's one of the reasons, I think, why not only modern Sinn Féin, but republicanism down the generations survives.
Protest is one thing, opposition another, government something else entirely. And in the South, that means coalition. And that means a real fear of repeating what happened to the Progressive Democrats and the Greens, political oblivion.
I can only speak for myself, because coalition issue is an issue that will be dealt with by a special Ardèche, so it's the membership which will decide that if there is an opportunity. For myself, I want to see a left-wing government. So that means it's the likes of the Labour Party we want to see stepping up to the mark and joining, coalescing with Sinn Féin in a potential government in the future. That's what I want to see. I would love to see a government of Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, or even Fine Gael. More importantly, what I'd more desire to see is Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil in opposition, so that we would have a real left-wing government. Personally, myself, the one party that I wouldn't be happy with going into government with in the next election is Fianna Fáil.
Well, I won't be going into coalition with them, I can assure you. I couldn't envisage a situation where I would be either a member of or support a government, including Sinn Féin, regardless of who else was supporting it or joining it.
So if after the next election the numbers were to add up in such a way that there could only be a viable Fianna Fáil Sinn Féin government, you're saying you'd resign?
I'm saying that Fianna Fáil would be mad. It would be mad to go into coalition with Sinn Féin, and they would be even more mad not to rule that out firmly now, well in advance of the election. And I'm confident that that's what they'll do, so the situation wouldn't arise anyway.
None of the establishing parties at the moment will I be comfortable with. Kind of Fianna Fáil has shown kind of its true colours over the last number of years, and in the last 2 years, Fine Gael and the Labour Party have shown their true colours. Their policies, in particular Labour policies, are not being implemented, and Sinn Féin would not be going into coalition with anybody in this state unless our policies were going to be implemented.
Can you ever see Fine Gael sharing power with Sinn Féin?
I don't see Fine Gael sharing power with a party that has policies that would bankrupt economically this country, that are financially unsustainable, that would return us to the type of difficulties we've seen in the past, or to a party, or with a party that hasn't yet, as I already said, fully come to terms with the conduct of the provisional IRA at a time when it was the front political organisation for that group.
You know, they go into government, there's a huge expectation. Next time around I expect they'll probably get somewhere near 30 seats. So they go into government 30 seats. They aren't able to deliver on the core promises because there's no ability to deliver on the core promises. And they will literally, they go back to the electorate a few years later, and I think they'll get a kicking that will make the PDs kicking and the Labour kicking look like a little slap.
We're not there yet, and we've a long way to go. You know, the party has been very small in its development in the South particularly, but we're getting there. We've doubled our membership in the last 2 years, and we'll continue. I want to see 100,000 people in Sinn Féin. I have no doubt about it, it's going to happen.
Sinn Féin is much maligned, but it keeps marching on. The ghosts of the past haunt the party, but are also a big part of its future. Martin Ferris's daughter, Teresia, is a Kerry County Councillor, widely tipped to succeed her father when he eventually retires as a TD. Mairead Farrell is part of the ambitious new generation. Her aunt was one of the 3 IRA members shot dead by British troops on the island of Gibraltar.
How big an influence was your aunt, Mairead Farrell, your namesake?
To be honest,
I don't think that she's as much an influence as a lot of people would assume. I think that she was murdered 2 years before I was born, and in that sense, of course, she was part of my upbringing, and I heard stories about her, but she was my aunt. She wasn't a political figure to me, so I think that it isn't as much an influence. I'm sure there is some sort of a subconscious influence that I'm not aware of.
Could you ever see yourself feeling so strongly about something that you'd be prepared to kill for it?
Well, I suppose, as I was saying, I mean, my aunt grew up in a society where she was treated as a second-class citizen, and the people around her were treated as second-class citizens. And I can't imagine the things they went through, the things they'd seen. So I really don't feel that I'm in a position to comment on that. Thankfully, I grew up in a completely different society. I'm very lucky in that sense.
The tussle between the past and the present will once again be under the spotlight on the 100th anniversary of the 1916 Easter Rising. Sinn Fein will be in the line of fire, and so too will its critics.
As a Northerner, you cannot help but be struck by the deep hypocrisy of all this stuff. Because all of the guys in Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael who were deploring the IRA and what they were doing in 1972, 1973, their fathers did the same stuff in 1920, 1921.
I mean, let's not do this southern naivety bit that our violence was okay and we will make heroes out of our violence. But see, these bad, evil black people in the north, their violence is not okay. IRA were bad, British were good, the Irish were good, and 1916 was good, but actually up here was bad. Not true. This is as complex up here in our age as it was in Dublin in that age.
For you, is there any difference between the violence of the Provisional IRA and the violence of the old IRA of Michael Collins?
Complete and fundamental difference.
What was it?
It was a struggle for national liberation. It was a struggle that had got a mandate from the 1918 general election. The Sinn Fein mandate then, which was that they would take their seats in, as it turned out, the Mansion House, but they would not go to the Imperial Parliament in Westminster.
We were passed over as second-class citizens, and that's what we inherited. So it's a bit rich then to moralise me about how I should respond to something from people who benefited from previous IRA violence. Because otherwise, how did the 26 county state come about? People have only been able to sit in Leinster House and legislate because the IRA went out and took lives. And if you go back and read the history of the IRA's war, the IRA was pretty ruthless, what they did. Pretty ruthless.
This country achieved its independence in 1922, and we went through the difficult period of a civil war. And the parties, or the majority of the parties who engaged in that civil war, ultimately settled down to engage in democratic politics. The IRA were of the view, and Sinn Fein as their political front organisation for many years, that you could carry the Armalite in one hand and the ballot box in another. But the overwhelming majority of the people on this island were committed to the ballot box, not the Armalite.
The core difference between the old IRA, my father's IRA, War of Independence, was that they had a mandate and the Sinn Fein people didn't have a mandate, and they went on for 30 years. 3,000 deaths, many people injured beyond repair, criminality, bank robberies, smuggling, drugs, and so on and so forth. That was totally anathema to the pure republicanism that my father's generation. My father went out on the Order of Collins to, sorry to be brutal about it now, but I mean it's the reality that he was after a British intelligence officer by the name of Noble. And my father knocked at the door and asked for Noble. And Noble wasn't in. And much to the relief of my father and his two comrades. But subsequently, of course, there were 13 or 14 people murdered. Was it by the Black and Tans in Croke Park? You know, so it was tit for tat. One was fighting for the Republic. One was fighting to hold on to a colony.
But David, your father was prepared to murder Noble.
My father was prepared not to murder. I wouldn't use the word murder. Was prepared to kill him in the name of the Republic. That on the instructions of Michael Collins.
Well, Gerry Adams would say, what's the difference?
No, I'm coming back to the mandate again.
The morality of the violence Michael Collins used is open to question. The only advantage he had is that ultimately, not initially as Robert Key and others have shown, but ultimately he had popular mandate and support for it. Ultimately, the Sinn Féin journey was the opposite. That they started their war without a popular mandate and support for it, and they began to get a popular mandate and support for their political activity, and that in a sense was used and was availed of by them.
Sinn Féin's website is typical of the party today. It presents a set of smiling faces and a modern progressive image. But look a bit closer at the online shop and a different story emerges. That of a party still celebrating tribal warfare, grievances going back hundreds of years, and of course the IRA.
The label that was used in the old days by the unionists and so on, Sinn Féin IRA, Sinn Féin IRA, was, we all thought at the time, unfair, because it was always identifying Sinn Féin with the IRA, Sinn Féin with the IRA. And I never used it myself, and politicians tried to avoid using it, and we talked about Sinn Féin. And we all went along with this idea that Sinn Féin was different. What we were doing was hoping and encouraging the growth of a political culture that is eventually going to separate itself from the violence. And this is essentially what happened.
If anybody ever had a choice about whether there should be a war or not be a war, of course there should not have been a war. But there was a war.
This idea that we were all in it together and that we are all victims is actually not true. We were not all guilty. People like all of us who are involved in the civil rights movement, absolutely against violence from any quarter, who are involved in politics and wanted to move forward politically, never supported violence. We were not guilty of anything. We were not, ordinary people in Northern Ireland were not all in it together.
People who would engage in that sort of activity have no conscience, they have no soul, they have no philosophy. They stand for nothing but violence and getting their own ends through violence. And these are the people who've spawned the modern Sinn Féin party. And these are the people whom the modern Sinn Féin party still refuses steadfastly to condemn.
There's no reason for it ever to reoccur. There is no reason. There's no reason, rationale, logic for armed actions by anyone from the Irish side, whatever position we take up, to engage in any armed actions.
The Provisional IRA killed more Irish people in that campaign than the Black and Tans and the British forces did during the entire War of Independence. And I just think it was so unnecessary, it could have been avoided. And whatever about where they are today, I think it's something for which they should never be forgiven.
Were you ever a member of the IRA?
No.
Never?
No.
Gerry Adams will say he was never a member of the IRA. How damaging is that to the necessity to tell the truth in a reconciliation process?
Well, Gerry Adams is on the public record as saying that if a truth and reconciliation of an international dimension is established, that he's prepared to go to it. And I have no doubt that he is prepared to go to it. I'm on the public record as saying that I am prepared to do the same thing.
But will he tell the truth about his membership of the IRA?
Well, we'll do that whenever we see the such a commission established, if it ever is established. I'm not going to tell anybody who was in the IRA or who wasn't in the IRA. Well, why should I do that?
Truth?
No, it's up to me to talk about my truth. It's up to everybody else who was involved in the conflict to tell their own truth.
Sinn Féin does its best to sing from the same hymn sheet, but it is a party under pressure. Pressure to come clean about the past, to stop defending violence and criminality, to prove that it is fit for government in the Republic, and to convince doubters that it can survive when its big names leave the stage.
You've been leader of Sinn Féin now for 30 years. That's an extraordinary long time. Now, you've said you will be leading Sinn Féin into the next general election. Is that still the case?
Yes.
It will be a delicate time when he decides, whenever he decides to step down.
Look, it's like in any, of course, I mean, he's Gerry Adams. He's been the party president for a long time, and not that he's been such a successful moulder of the party that we have.
And there is
and
a danger
the politics
that it could all come tumbling down when he leaves.
Well, there is that danger, of course, but we may. it's our job to make sure that doesn't happen. That's our job.
Gerry Adams has been leader now for 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
He can't go on forever. What's going to happen when he steps down?
A new leader will be elected.
And would you like to be a contender?
Not at this time.
But whenever he steps down?
Well, that all depends on timing. Genuinely. If, you know, we have a public persona. We have the job that we have to do on behalf of Sinn Féin, on behalf of our constituents, on behalf of our country. But we also have a private life. We also have a family. We also have young children. And, you know, you have to balance all of that out. And for me personally, if I was to take on more responsibility, it would tip the balance completely in the wrong direction. It's one of my biggest fears in life, that at some time in the future I will regret the amount of time I've spent away from my children and my family. And that is a major consideration. So I can genuinely say that at this time I have no desire to take on any more responsibility than I currently have. That may change as things change, as my family grow up and things evolve, but that's the position that I'm in at this point in time.
The other likely contender for the Sinn Féin leadership, whenever Gerry Adams steps down, was more forthcoming.
Could you ever see yourself as party leader?
Not in the short term, but I wouldn't rule it out longer term. No, it's not something that I am concerned with now. But at some stage, I mean, if there were a vacancy, I would certainly consider it.
Right. Okay.
Well, we're blessed with a raft of leaders, and it isn't within my authority, and I'm not inclined to anoint. You know, look at the last person who was anointed by an outgoing leader. That's not the business I'm about.
We are internationalists. We are in solidarity with people in struggle throughout the globe. So from this Ardèche, from the west of Ireland, I want to send a message to South Africa of love and solidarity to our friend and our comrade, Madiba Nelson Mandela.
Is he on par with the likes of Nelson Mandela?
Don't make me laugh. It's not a serious question, is it? No.
Is he on par with the likes of Nelson Mandela?
No. I mean, Mandela was involved in the physical force movement, you know, linked to the ANC, but he had made it absolutely clear even before his release that there was going to be no going back there, and furthermore, that the real task was one of reconciliation, which he committed himself to very effectively.
Would you put him on par with the likes of Nelson Mandela?
Well, he is a leader, you know, and this island is much smaller than, of course, South Africa. But he has a status and qualities that obviously those people recognise in him. You know, that Mandela would meet Adams, that Castro would meet Adams, that Tony Blair would meet Adams, that Bill Clinton, George Bush, whether or not you'd want to meet George Bush is another question. But obviously he has a status which is recognised by those people.
Would you put him on par with the likes of Nelson Mandela?
No. And I'm not saying that as in any way being insulting to Gerry Adams. I think Nelson Mandela is in a league of his own.
Everyone has a strong opinion about Sinn Féin, but the question remains.
So who, in essence, are Sinn Féin?
Sinn Féin are the people. They're the Irish people. It's we ourselves. It's the Irish people. It's about that vehicle. It's about providing you that platform. The same way we did in 1918. The same way we did, you know, when Irish people were able to rally round the banner of Sinn Féin and say, this is something we believe in.
Well, they're part of the Irish Republican movement who tried to impose their will upon the people of Ireland, of Northern Ireland as well, and who failed. And they failed primarily because the people of Northern Ireland were not prepared to allow themselves to be pushed around by them.
We're just ordinary people. We're just ordinary Irish citizens who dream about a better life for ourselves, for our children, for our neighbours. It's about creating, we're there to try and create a country that's very similar to the Ireland we live in today, but just better.
I regard them as a very interesting political party now who came from the same old background of Irish militant history, who have made a journey that many before them made, but in some ways they made this modern Sinn Féin perhaps made it more successful. Now whether that's down to their genius or just down to good luck, I would put it down to good luck.
There was a time when I was told that my life was in danger, but I don't get up in the morning worrying about these things. You know, I'm very proud of the role I've played in the peace process. I know that there are some people who don't like that role and who hate me for it. And that's fair enough. They have a right to do that. But I mean, if they were going to kill me because of my role in the peace process, I'll die happily for that, for peace.
I just think it's wonderful to have been able, despite the tragedy, the hurt, the legacy of the war, that we have come out of war, that we're now in a peaceful dispensation, not perfect, but there's now a good way, an intelligent way, a fair way, a democratic way, a peaceful way to argue whatever you want to argue for. And I think that's been a huge achievement.
Their problem, I think, is, much and all as they might want it, Sinn Féin can't lose the Northern Ireland bit, but they can't lose the residual feeling on the part of people, you didn't have to kill all those people.